Today we're going to review how to put an equation into slope-intercept form, and then we're going to look at how to compare two equations to see if they're parallel, perpendicular, or neither. Let's first recall that slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b, and it's important for you to realize the structure of this equation. So first, recognize that y is by itself on one side of the equal sign, and then the mx term is right after the equal sign, and then the y-intercept is at the very end. So it's kind of like three parts, but that equal sign is very important, that the y is on the left or on one side of it, and then everything else is on the other. So if we look at number 1, notice here's our equal sign right here. So basically we need the y term to be on this side, and then we need everything else to be on this other side. So if we look at it just using algebra, we need to get rid of this term here, this entire x term. So your first step needs to be to move the entire x term if it's on the wrong side. So to do that, we use basic principles of algebra. If it is a negative 3x, we are going to add 3x to both sides. So we're just going to add 3x because if we want to move something, we have to invert it. So if we undo the operation there, we now moved the 3x on the right side, but it's very, very, very important that you remember these are not like terms. So you cannot actually add them together. All you can do is write them side by side, but in the order you want them in. So we want the x term first, and then we want, since this is a positive 6, I'm going to put plus 6. So then we want the y-intercept after, but that doesn't mean that's the y-intercept yet. We have to finish solving. So I'm going to bring down my equal sign, and I'm going to bring down my 2y. So notice the equation is almost in the form we want it in, because we almost have y on the left, and then we have the mx plus b part kind of looking how it should, but there's still that 2 in front of the y. So remember to get rid of a number in front of a variable, since that represents multiplication. To undo it, you have to divide by that number. And remember, when you divide everything. So multiplication or division, you do every term. So now we have y equal to, well, 2 doesn't divide evenly into 3, so we're just going to leave that in simplified form, which is just 3 over 2, because it doesn't simplify. And then we have our x, and then 6 divided by 2 is 3. So now we have y by itself, we have our equal sign, we have our mx part, and then we have our y-intercept part. And notice that's the same way the equation should look based off of slope-intercept form. So now we can actually determine the two things they want us to determine. Let me go ahead and circle our box in my slope-intercept form. But remember, the number in front of x, that is your slope. So our slope is 3 over 2. And our y-intercept is the number after x, which is a positive 3. So now number 2 is very similar, so I'm not going to do number 2 necessarily. I'll just kind of skip around a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and jump to number 3. So once again, I'm trying to get in slope-intercept form, so I am going to draw my line down my equal sign that separates my sides of my equation. Remember, your first step is to move the x term. You want to move that over if it's not already on that side. So to do that, since it's negative x, we have to undo it by putting plus x. Basically, once you get the hang of this, you realize the rule is if you want to change the side the term's on, you got to just change the sign. So all I'm doing is changing the sign because I want to change the side that the term is on. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and cross that out. So I'm going to bring down everything I haven't used as I go along here. My equal signs there. Remember, these are not like terms, so you cannot add those together. That is not the same thing as saying 6x, because remember, 6x is multiplication. We need it to say 6 plus x, or that's the same thing as a positive x and a positive 6. So right there, we almost have it in slope-intercept form, but we can't have a number in front of y, so we're going to divide by that number. So now we have y equals. Now some people are like, well, how do I write this? How do I divide 2 into x? Remember, there's an understood 1 you can put in front of x if you need a number there, because 1 times x is still x. So really that's 1 divided by 2, which is still 1/2 because it doesn't simplify. And then that's 6 divided by 2 again, so that's just 3. So that is our slope-intercept form. So now we can go ahead and write the slope. Remember, slope is the number in front of x. It's not the x, it's just the number in front. And then the y-intercept is our number behind. It's actually very close to number 1, so we did number 1, 3. And I wanted to correct an error here. It looks like on number 5. This is missing its equal sign. So if you'll just squeeze its equal sign in there, that way it's there. I don't want to actually do that one though. Let's just do one more problem by looking at, let's go with number 6, just for the sake of it. Alright, so once again, we're going to draw our line down our equal sign. We need to get rid of the x term, so I'm just going to subtract x from both sides. So remember that inverts the operation, and now I can bring down the 4y, my equal sign, and remember we're just going to write our x term in front because slope-intercept form, we want the x term in front. It's kind of like our mx term. And then remember we can't have a number in front of y, so we're going to divide everything by that 4. So now we have y equals, now remember there's an understood one we could put there if we need it. So -1/4, that is not -4, that's -1/4, people, x, and then 32 divided by 4 is +8. So now we have it in slope-intercept form. Now we can go ahead and judge what the slope is, which is -1/4, and +8 is our y-intercept. Notice that those numbers are nowhere in the beginning of the problem. So unless you have it in slope-intercept form, you cannot properly say what the slope and the y-intercept is. So make sure you know you got to get it into that form. So you all will finish up the problems on the front page, but now let's go ahead and look at some of the problems on the back so you can kind of see what you're doing there. So you have to determine whether or not the two equations form parallel, perpendicular, or intersecting lines. And to do that, we have to recall what we talked about last time with parallel, perpendicular lines. Alright, so when we talked about parallel lines, we said parallel lines have the same slope, and remember in an equation, the slope is the m. So we're going to be looking to see what the m value is to see whether or not the equations have the same slope. And remember on a graph, same slope basically looks like two lines that are equally spaced the entire time because they'll never intersect. Now perpendicular lines, on the other hand, remember they cross and they form 90-degree angles. So basically we also talked about their slope having opposite signs and that they were reciprocals. Alright, so we'll go ahead and look to see whether or not we have that going on with the slopes. Or lastly, if you rule out parallel and you rule out perpendicular and you notice neither of those two are going on, then we just have two lines that intersect in some form or fashion. There's really nothing special about their slopes, there's no pattern to them, but we do know that they have neither of those two things going on. So now let's go ahead and do a few problems so you can kind of understand what you have to do. So in order to tell whether or not the equations are parallel, perpendicular, or intersecting, the first thing you need to do is make sure the equation is in slope-intercept form. So kind of like we did on this page where we had to put the equation in slope-intercept form, you need to just make sure your equations are there already, or if not, you need to go ahead and rearrange it. So we'll go ahead and look at number 1. I just always compare it to y equals mx plus b and make sure that it's actually in that order. And notice the first equation is, so it's good. We can identify that m in that equation is equal to -4. In the second equation, y equals mx plus b, if I compare it, everything is lined up. Y is in the right place, the equal sign is in the right place, and then our m we can identify is 1/4. So comparing these two slopes right here, we notice, one, that they're not the exact same slope. negative 4 is not the same thing as 1/4, so we know it's not parallel. But the second thing we could look at is perpendicular. Notice the signs are opposite signs, one's positive, one's negative. And then if we wanted to look, remember the reciprocal, if we wanted to look to see if it's perpendicular, you have to think of a whole number like 4, or actually an integer, as 4/1, and then if you flipped it over, would it be the other slope? Yes, it would be. It would be 1/4 if you flipped it over. So therefore, they have the opposite signs and they have the reciprocals. And remember, it has to be both. They have to have both going on. So therefore, since we have opposite reciprocals, we do have perpendicular lines. Alright, so that's number 1. And I'm just going to bounce around to do a few problems here. So the next one I want to look at is number 3. And I don't know why the numbers go down here, but they do. But let's look at number 3. And if we compare the first equation to y equals mx plus b, we'll notice it is in the correct form already. So we can notice our m is equal to negative 5/4 in the first equation. And then if we compare the second equation, you can tell right away that's not in y equals mx plus b form because y is not first. It's not by itself on one side the equal sign. So we're just going to go ahead and rearrange it like we did on the front of the paper. So notice we need to move that x term over, and to move it, we need to invert the operation. So we're going to add 5x to both sides. Remember, you just bring down everything that you haven't used. And you do not combine those because they're not like terms. You just write them in the right order. So now we're going to go ahead and divide both sides by 4 to get rid of that 4. And now we have y equals 5/4 x minus, and this could be simplified to 4. So now we can identify our slope if this is y equals mx plus b form now. We know our slope is 5/4. And if we go ahead and compare these two, you could see that we have a negative and we have a positive. Although you may say, oh, they're parallel, they're the same. No, they're not the same. One's a negative, one's a positive. Although they look like they're the same fraction, they're opposite signs. And if you remember, to be parallel, you have to have the same slope, meaning identical. We don't have identical slopes here, so it's definitely not parallel. So the next thing is perpendicular. Well, remember with perpendicular has to have opposite signs and reciprocals. So yeah, it has, oops, wrong way. It has opposite signs, one's a negative, one's a positive, but we don't have the reciprocals going on here. So this one is actually, they got neither thing going on. Oops, didn't mean to do that. All right, they have neither situation, so therefore they're just intersecting lines. Oops, don't need an S on that. All right, so we just have intersecting lines there. And the last one I want to look at is number 8, just to do, one here, one there. So number 8, we look like we have the first one already in slope-intercept form for us. Remember, if there's no number directly in front of x, you can put a 1 there because multiplying by 1 won't change x. So let me actually circle that all together. Our m is equal to -1 for the first equation. The second equation, it is not in y equals mx plus b form. Notice the x is not in the right place. So we are going to have to rearrange this equation. So we subtract the x from both sides. Since it is positive, we want to get rid of it by making it negative or subtracting it. We can think of it like that. And we're going to bring down our y, our equal sign. And remember, you do not combine these. You just write them in the order you want them in. That's a +8. And notice from there, right away, we have it now in y equals mx plus b form. Some people like to divide by the number in front of y all the time, even when it's a 1. But if you really think about it, if you ever find yourself dividing by 1, it'll never change anything. Because any number divided by 1 is still that number. So it doesn't matter if you sit there and go through and divide everything by 1, you're just going to get the same equation again. So it's kind of like a waste of time. Alright, so now if you go ahead and look at our m, well, there's a negative there, but notice we can put a 1 in front if we need to identify what our m is. So m is equal to -1 there as well. So notice here we have the same slopes. So therefore we have parallel lines. Alright, so it looks like we did one of each. We did a perpendicular, we did intersecting, and we did parallel. So go ahead and finish up the ones that we did not do together and then submit your work.